Okay, I think we can start. We have a good number of people already joined. My name is Harjeet Singh, and I'm the Global Engagement Director with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. A warm welcome to you for joining this very important and interesting conversation, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy. We also have interpretation, Spanish and French, so you must be familiar with Zoom. If not, you can click the interpretation icon. That's a globe icon, and then you can select the language you want. If you want English, you can select that. And similarly, we have French and Spanish. So you can choose the language you want, and further instructions coming by my colleague Zoe on the chat. And we have a very powerful panel, and you will hear from them. I'm going to start with some context setting. So people who are aware of the treaty, I'm sure would know who we are and what we are doing. But for those who are new to this initiative, I'm going to make a very brief introduction of treaty and why we exist and why we are making this very bold demand. I'll request my colleague Shibayan to put the presentation. And just let me give you the flow. So I'll present about the treaty, and then I'll invite Harpreet Kaur Paul to present the findings of the report that we did on principles, values, and ideals. And then we will have a couple of responses and brief intervention by Kathy Orlando, who I'll introduce later. And then we will have Dr. Amira Savas, who will present the just transition work that we are doing. So that's the flow. And we are now going to start the presentation. Shivayan. Okay, I think Shivayan dropped or no? Shivayan, are you able to display the presentation? Okay, it's coming. Right. So this discussion is about values and ideals that we have developed as part of the process to craft the treaty. And as Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, we are making this bold demand to have a new treaty in the form of a global framework that complements Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. And if you're wondering why we need a treaty when we already have a convention, a Paris Agreement, the reason we need that because we know that three products, coal, oil, and gas, as fossil fuels, they have caused the climate crisis, the primary drivers of the climate crisis. Yet, in the last 30 years, we have not been able to reduce the use of fossil fuels. In fact, we see production going up to the tune of 110% compared to what is consistent to stay below 1.5 and to adopt that pathway, which means that we are going to be adding fuel to the fire that's already causing so much of damage all around us. And that's something which we cannot achieve. We cannot target the fossil fuel industry. We cannot put pressure on the government unless we have a global framework. Next slide, please. And as I said, we continue to remain dependent on fossil fuels. So even if we celebrate renewable energy uptake and even revolution, as we call sometimes, but if you look at the share of renewables in our global energy mix, it's only feeding to the increased demand largely, and our dependence on fossil fuels remains the same over the last few decades. And that is something which is so concerning and clearly demonstrates that we are not on track and there is something wrong with the system that we have. And unless and until at the global level, we have a new framework, we will not be able to phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. Next slide, please. And we failed over the last 30 years because neither Paris Agreement nor the convention, which was agreed in 1992, mentioned fossil fuels. Only after putting so much of pressure by civil society, by climate justice movements, we barely able to manage a language which is also so weak. It says transitioning away from fossil fuels that we got at COP28, which has a lot of loopholes and qualifiers and dangerous distractions or false solutions. So we know that UNFCCC is not able to actually hold the polluters to account, be it countries or fossil fuel industry. So we need a framework that complements the Paris Agreement. Next slide. And the most important thing is that if we don't have a system that provides international cooperation and support, countries who are least responsible and who are dependent, in developing countries who are dependent on fossil fuels for jobs, for energy, for revenue, they will not be able to phase out. So we cannot compare Libya with Canada. We cannot compare UK with Iraq. And you see, I know it's not very readable, but you can figure out that on x-axis we are talking about the phase out year, and that's actually part of a much detailed report called Equity Review, where we have looked at which country has what responsibility and who should phase out when, and then also look at the per capita income of countries, and that's where we determine who needs to not only phase out fast but also provide support to other developing countries. Next slide. And if we don't get that agreement, if we don't have that framework, if we don't have international cooperation and support, the transition is going to be extremely hard. And there's no guarantee it's going to be a just transition. We will see stranded assets, we'll see risk to workers and communities. It's going to delay renewable energy, as we are already seeing that it's, despite the growth, it's not displacing fossil fuels. It's going to delay economic diversification. And then it's going to also bring in all kinds of false solutions like dangerous geoengineering, and of course, temperature will continue to rise and will cause havoc to people, ecosystems, and economy. Next slide. And that's why this initiative, which now has support of 13 nation states, led by Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and many other Pacific nations who have joined. And recently we got Colombia and Timor-Leste, who are dependent on fossil fuels, who are involved in extraction, yet they have joined the initiative, underlining the fact that they want to move away from fossil fuels and they would like to get more international cooperation and support. So this block of nations is right now in the process of crafting the treaty, and they are going to be leading that effort. Next slide. And we have support a lot of groundswell that we have seen over the last 3 years, where we have more than 2,500 civil society organizations, 9 indigenous nations, more than 110 cities and subnational governments, 1 million people supporting the call for treaty, 800 parliamentarians calling for fossil fuel-free future, more than 3,000 scientists, even private sector banks are coming up with as an alliance saying that we need to move away from fossil fuels. Next slide. So moving on, as we craft the treaty, just to reiterate, there are 3 pillars. Just transition is what our main target is. That's what countries need to achieve, and that requires financial and technical support. And to enable that, we need to stop all the expansion now. And that's why we say non-proliferation, drawing from the anti-nuclear movement, that we cannot continue to expand, we cannot continue to increase the problem, knowing that every ton of carbon is going to make the climate crisis worse. And then we want a fair phase out. As you saw that chart, we can't just expect all countries to do same level of effort. There are countries who are historically responsible, who have a lot more resources. They have to do much more and support other countries. So those are the key tenets of the fossil fuel treaty that we are demanding. And I'm now going to invite Harpreet, who is a human rights lawyer and a climate justice activist, and has worked across the whole spectrum of climate action, be it fossil fuel phase out, be it loss and damage and demanding finance. And she has been very involved with the climate justice movement. And she has worked with us on this principles, values, and ideals report, conducting many consultations. So over to you, Harpreet.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and for the opportunity to present some of the findings of this very participatory process with you all. It was very much a joint effort led by Harjeet and Rebecca, the Treaty Initiative, and then with Satat Sampada, Jyoti Akanksha, Heidi, and myself, engaging over 20 consultations with more than 240 participants. These consultations took place in regions, Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, Pacific, and North America, but also across themes, human rights, peace and security, health, labor, youth, faith, gender, Indigenous peoples, and frequently took place in English, French, and Spanish. In the next slide, you'll see a quote which highlights one way in which this very participatory process was valued by participants. The way in which participants spoke about the process of arriving at a treaty felt just as important as what the ultimate outcome would be. And of course, that process directly impacting the future outcome was a key value that came up consistently and which we'll come back to. In the next slide, you'll see that we used a metaphor for a tree in designing the consultations. So while participants were given access to a background paper on legal frameworks that were relevant to the three core pillars of the proposed treaty, just transition, non-proliferation, and a fair phase out, participants were also encouraged to contribute creatively beyond existing sources of law, really recognizing that existing international treaty and customary laws have fallen short, and that new provisions could potentially leapfrog old problems to finally protect people and planet. The metaphor of the tree was chosen so that the roots are the foundation of the treaty from which the three pillars or the trunk are able to grow, and the operationalization of values and pillars are symbolized by the branches, and the vision by the flowers or fruit. So I should say that the three values you see at the root, which are shown in a little bit more detail in the next slide, were analyzed through really rich inputs of data across listening for nearly 2,000 hours of engagement, for which we have huge gratitude. The diversity and complexity of ideas that were shared can't be represented in 3 or 4 words, as we've attempted to do here. But what we also wanted to do was really acknowledge that while participants had a diversity of experience and ideas, there were also universal themes that kept coming up. And we've tried to summarize these through a data analysis of those nearly 2,000 hours and arrived at the 3 fundamental values of justice, right, and the public good. So delving into justice in a little bit more detail in the next slide, participants recognized that countries in the global north have used up most of the carbon budget to limit warming to Paris Agreement levels. And this gives them particular responsibilities to stop reliance on fossil fuels and engage in a just transition domestically, but also to support transitions globally, given the scale of their responsibility for cumulative emissions. Participants also talked about the importance of enforcement in this, whether it's attempting to enforce existing forms of international environmental law, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, human rights norms, customary international law, and notions of polluter pays, prevention, compensation, reparation, repairing lands and communities devastated by extraction, frequently came up in terms of equity and enforceability. But so did the need to promote solutions that were just and didn't replicate extractivism to raw earth minerals and metals, which are necessary for a renewable energy transition, but which could replicate resource allocations that have been unfair and can potentially continue to be unfair if false solutions aren't addressed. Participants also talked about the need to acknowledge that past emissions and cumulative emissions are also driving current climate change impacts, and the need to address that in addition to having a forward-looking approach. And participants raised concerns that there have within the UNFCCC, and even prior to the adoption of the UNFCCC, been many attempts to try and operationalize legal architecture of responsibility and accountability that has compensatory consequences. Participants talked about the inception of the UNFCCC even calling for taxes on fossil fuels consumed in early industrialized nations, and up until the fourth and fifth drafts of the convention, including references to responsibility to rectify damage linked to climate change impacts for global north countries. And then during negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol, Brazil did seek differentiated emission reduction targets based on responsibility in a clean development fund that could accrue finances from penalties imposed on Annex 1 parties that failed to comply with their specified reduction targets. And it was proposed that that fund would support mitigation and adaptation efforts in non-Annex 1 parties. And Brazil proposed a methodology for arriving at notions of cumulative, notions of responsibility that recognize cumulative emissions, but that proposal didn't go ahead. And again, in negotiations for the Paris Agreement, the Africa Group of Negotiators proposed an equity reference calculator. And again, that proposal didn't go ahead. So the need for civil society-led movements in support of justice to help curtail history repeating itself and ensure that justice is central to a treaty is something that was consistently raised. I'm going to pause for a moment, and in the spirit of the original consultations, which were very participatory, I am going to ask that you take a moment to click on the link that Shaban will post in the chat in a few moments. And if you could follow me to slide 18, you will see that there is a question and a spectrum line, and the question asks, to what extent are you hopeful about a new treaty operationalizing justice? And across that spectrum line, on the left side is hopeful, on the right side is cynical, and in the middle says depends on a lot. And if you could entertain us for a moment and just select on an animal or a flower and drag it to a place on the spectrum line that reflects where you're feeling at the moment in response to that question. And we'll come back to your inputs at the end of the session. I can see lots of movement, so thank you to those that are engaging with that. If we move to the next slide for now, I'll come back to discuss some of those inputs at the end, but we'll move to the second theme that came up. Participants talked about the role that the treaty could play in reducing the likelihood of escalating climate tipping points, and therefore protecting the right to life, health, and a clean environment for future generations, and also reducing fossil fuel-related resource conflict and positively contributing to peace and security. In addition to having this forward-looking approach to rights protection, participants consistently raised the importance of addressing rights violations historically and to date at present sites of fossil fuel extraction, from exposure to toxins to violence against land defenders, Indigenous peoples, and human rights activists, and a question around how treaty mechanisms could hold corporations and states accountable for the present and the past while moving forward came up a lot. In looking forward, participants raised the importance of just transitions that supported workers' rights, with the treaty needing to explicitly recognize the rights of unions, including social dialogue, freedom of association, and collective bargaining, and the need for intersectionally just social protection that embedded participation rights too, from the local, regional, and global design, implementation, and monitoring of future treaty. Speaking of participation, there was strong emphasis on limiting corporate participation, especially those engaged in fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel finance, and in promoting false solutions. The third theme that came up, and which is in the next slide, was the public good and the need for the treaty to propose solutions that centered well-being, that didn't replicate an unfair allocation of resources for the already wealthy and for protecting corporate interests. Themes around energy equity within and between countries came up, and Africa consultation participants were keen to ensure that new renewable energy initiatives ensure just extraction with full prior and informed consent of impacted communities. A concern that came up consistently was how the treaty might engage with other parts of international law, policy, and practice, whether that's trade and investment provisions or the circulation of private finance. I think we're at something like nearly $7 trillion of private finance for the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement was signed, that continues to provide support, credit, and insurance to the fossil fuel industries. Ultimately, though, there was a really strong feeling that if participants could come together in demands for a treaty that centered justice, then having justice, the public good, and rights centered in the treaty could support a vision of well-being, self-determination, and thriving ocean and ecosystems. In slide 21 of the slide deck, we have some editable post-it notes, and I wanted to invite participants to just take a moment to reflect on what might resonate and what gaps there might be. And we can pause and come back to reviewing some of those before hearing from some of the other panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. Shiban, we can stop sharing and we can now move to the next section. And of course, we'll give you a minute to provide your inputs on the slide as Harpreet shared. You can share your reflections, and we will also have a Q&A section later. So before we move to other part, let me also invite, and it's my pleasure to welcome Kathy Orlando, who has been such a strong supporter of the treaty initiative. She works as the program director at Citizens Climate International in Canada. She leads an exceptional team. She directs program that supports volunteers in over 75 countries. And she has been lobbying Canadian government since 2010, and US Congress and World Bank and IMF. And she's a recipient of many, many awards for her activism and work that she has been doing in Canada and beyond in many other countries. So such a pleasure to have you, Kathy. And we would like to request you to reflect on what you heard. And of course, you have been very much part of the process of consultations, and you've been attending and following the work of treaty and supporting it. So, and particularly linking with your work on youth. So youth participants in this consultation spoke passionately both about leveraging new technology to promote efficient transitions going forward, while also addressing the impacts already underway. How you think youth delegates might continue to support a holistic approach to non-proliferation of fossil fuels and their contribution to treaty and this new framework. So your reflections.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really honored to be here today. So, yes, I first would like to just set the ground upon which we are walking on. We are in a climate emergency and we must get off of fossil fuels fast. We all know that. And um, I live in a country that's a fossil fuel producer, and I know firsthand no country wants to give up their production first. So we need a treaty to get us there. The youth are ideal to have this holistic approach to getting off of fossil fuels and towards the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have moral authority. They have a right to a livable future, and we are robbing them of that currently. Then that gives them the moral authority. You cannot argue with what they say. They also have immense powers. We live in a post-COVID, post-pandemic world, and we may have forgotten what happened in 2018 and 2019. I was in Madrid at the conference of the parties when Greta Thunberg broke onto the scene. I saw everything unfold in 2019 with Vanessa Nakate and just this massive explosion of youth. They were powerful. They raised the awareness of the emergency that we are in. Um, and studies have shown that when they mobilize, people start to really think about the climate crisis. So they are powerful voices, and they know the issue. They know that fossil fuel companies have been lying to us for decades. They understand the intersections. I have learned so much from them. They know the colonial structures. Like prior to 2019, I never gave much thought to the colonial structures that got us to this point. They have given me a university education worth of understanding of that. They have changed my minds. They know what the false solutions are. You know, we cannot expand fossil fuels and under the guise that carbon capture and sequestration and offsets are going to offset that. That's a myth. That's a unicorn myth. They are hyper connected, and also they have the power to elevate climate stories because we know at climate justice stories, we know at the end of the day, it's the stories that will change us. So their hyper connectedness, their authentic voices, and their own lived experiences will have the power to just propel this forward. So that's my reflection. And thank you for the opportunity to reflect.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Your passion, your commitment is so visible in what you're saying, and how it has energized us and the movement on what's needed, and how when you target the fossil fuel industry and also connect that, as you very rightly said, with all those bigger challenges of historical injustice and inequality and colonialism and racism and everything that affects us. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for all your inputs in this journey to bring it to this level. I'm now going to move to Dr. Amira Savas, who is our colleague, head of research and policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. She's a feminist researcher and advocates the intersection of climate change, gender, public participation, and the social contract. She brings 20 years of experience working on issues across academia, private sector, think tanks, NGOs. We work together in ActionAid, and she also worked at Climate Outreach. Such a pleasure to have her in our team, and she's leading our work on policy. So she's going to actually connect this piece. So the principles, so values and ideals that we have developed, which are going to be the bedrock of the new treaty that's going to be crafted. And while we continue to work on just transition, so she's going to talk about just transition pillar a bit more significance and what we are planning to do going forward. So over to you, Amira.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully it won't take too long. Yes. Just let me know if you're not seeing them in a few seconds. So yeah, my role has been excellent. My role has been to start exploring what the global conversations are actually around a global just transition, because obviously, and connected to what has been discussed already, most countries of, the global south as problematic as that term lumping countries together is, but for the purpose of being quick here, most of them are economically marginalized, geopolitically marginalized, and are expected to make transitions which will require a big amount of effort, to particularly for countries who are currently dependent on fossil fuels for government revenues and for GDP. And so the biggest kind of question that we often will be asked is, how are you going to help us, or how will a treaty help us to actually facilitate, you know, the financial needs for a global just transition? And so I've been looking quite a lot at what's out there at the moment. But just to kind of echo the way that we think about this, you know, this diagram here is from the Civil Society Equity Review, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, who have looked at the carbon budget that we have, to you know, actually meet the limit of 1.5 degrees articulated under the Paris Agreement. And they've also looked at the dependencies that different countries have on fossil fuels, and basically said there's 4 categories of countries. I mean, obviously some of this will seem common sense. There are countries who have high dependence on fossil fuels, but also have, you know, more power in this system and less need to actually be on those fossil fuels and can move off of them straight away. Then there's countries who are dependent and who are marginalized in that economic and political system, and marginalized by the constraints around trade and other barriers, trade and investment being huge, debt also being huge, and they need support financially and also in terms of capacity support to actually plan a transition that is fair for everybody. And so there are these 4 categories, and everybody needs to play their part. And that if we're able to bring countries on board around a timeline where, you know, the most time is given to countries that are more dependent and require more support because of the historical marginalization factors, that is going to help us do this together and build trust that we can actually phase out in line with what's left in terms of the carbon budget. So we do, you know, think about it from the perspective of how the Civil Society Equity Review have mapped it out. And this is just a summary of the latest analysis from last year, a really good report that I recommend having a look at, which, you know, basically maps out that, you know, that plot of who should phase out and by when. And so, yeah, the issue that we have at the moment is that the Paris Agreement, as important as it is, doesn't actually create that transition plan. It doesn't actually create that phase plan around supply, which is why we have 110% more production planned than is actually compatible with the 1.5 degree goal. So we really need international cooperation, and we really need to build trust between states around how to actually make that happen. So what have we been doing under this kind of work? We've looked at the ideas that are out there at the moment that could be relevant to a treaty and just transition finance. So there's so many conversations going on under different areas of relevance around debt, around trade and investment. There's some newer conversations around how you replace fossil fuel revenues. So there are all these sorts of different ideas and proposals. There isn't so much of a through line story or pathway yet that they're starting to emerge, but we wanted to see what's out there. We also spoke to many stakeholders that we know and a number of political stakeholders and advisors to get a sense of how these different proposals are landing. So which ones might actually pick up speed or have salience in, you know, in negotiations, in different kinds of negotiations. And we've started to assess these proposals in different ways. So there's 3, let me just see if I have that on the next slide. No. So we've looked at them in 3 ways. One is political salience, as I just mentioned. The other one is, to what extent does this proposal actually meet the timeline? You know, we're dealing with a very, you know, we're in a crisis mode, as we've heard, and I'm sure you all agree. We've got 6 years left to stay within this 1.5 degree limit and a very small carbon budget. So we need ideas that can move quickly, but we also, in the third area, we need ideas that align with justice and equity, which is why this principles work is absolutely fundamental. So, you know, we want to promote and support parties to negotiate around instruments and mechanisms that are not crossing any red lines for civil society and also for government sovereignty, because, you know, there are risks around some ideas being proposed that they could be closing down on, you know, or like creating further power dynamics in the longer term for governments as well. So the principles work has been really fundamental as a kind of foundation for having a look at these different proposals. And as I sort of mentioned before, it seems that there are these clusters of ideas at the moment. One kind of cluster area is on the you know, the crisis of debt injustice and how that's becoming worse due to climate impacts. I mean, Hurricane Beryl is a really present example of that. You know, the fact that I believe it wiped out something like 90% of Dominica's GDP. So we're working with an unequal playing field, and a lot of that is being driven by the debt crisis as well. So what are the mechanisms that are out there that can support countries that are facing debt to actually address that in a fair way, to crowd in more opportunities for financing a global just transition? And then, of course, there's the issues around trade and investment. So the huge trade barriers that are preventing technology transfer, or even just preventing countries developing their own technologies that could build their power in the global landscape when it comes to green tech and so on. So, you know, there's this expectations that countries across the global south will transition to renewables super fast. And, you know, I'm currently at a conference with a number of countries here who are saying, look, you know, that requires tech. Like one of them gave the example of, you know, we have this particular technology that requires somebody from the company Philips to come. We've had this for 20 years in our factories, in our power stations, but somebody from a northern company has to come because we're not allowed access to the tech. So there's issues around trade. The capital cost issues are absolutely huge, and we've been hearing that from countries for a while now. Like, it's so much more expensive to access capital investment for countries, for example, in the African continent than in Europe. And it's also more expensive to access that for renewable energy than fossil fuels. So we have an issue there that we need some mechanisms around. And finally, the big one, which is, you know, replacing fossil fuel revenues. When some countries rely on fossil fuels for up to 92% of their revenues, their public services. So these are the kind of areas that where there are different ideas, but there's very few articulation of them in a pathway. There are a couple. One, again, I'm sure you're all aware, Bridgetown. The Bridgetown Initiative does look at a comprehensive range of actions. There isn't, you know, it's building some political salience. It's very important. It's led by Barbados and Prime Minister Mia Mottley. So it has that southern leadership. But there's perhaps not enough there at the moment on the fossil fuel revenues piece. And then the V20, the Vulnerable 20 nations, which actually I believe has 68 nations now, are doing some really interesting work around climate prosperity plans, where they're saying these are the big projects and plans we want investment in, but we also want deals from the financiers that we're not going to be treated unequally, and we're actually going to be able to access this investment in the long term. So I've mentioned the relationship to the values and ideals, which of course are providing a kind of through line of all of this. So I'm just going to run really quickly through some of the mapping, but this is not all of the mechanisms that are out there. This is just as an illustration. So, you know, there are a number of debt and fiscal constraints mechanisms and instruments being discussed at the moment, and that we're looking at who's proposing them as well, because we also have to decolonize the knowledge, right? And we have to decolonize who comes up with the ideas and which ideas are honored and pick up speed and so on. So there's a number of ones around debt. One of the ones that is starting to pick up more interest around addressing debt from an equity perspective is innovations to the IMF special drawing rights. They, you know, I can go into detail about that, but I don't have time now. On new forms of finance and investment, there's a lot of different ideas. some of them, again, coming from multilaterals, some of them coming from experts in civil society. Then there's loads on tax. I never thought I would be so interested in tax, but actually it's critical. And there's a great example, you know, the 2% wealth tax is picking up speed at the moment. So that could be interesting, particularly because it's proposed by Brazil, the president of the G20 and COP next year. But also the climate damages tax, which, you know, some of our colleagues on the call have led thinking on, which could really, you know, taxing extraction of fossil fuels in the richest economies could really raise a huge amount of finance that could, you know, partly support and finance just transition across the global south. On replacing fossil fuel revenues, again, there's not enough, there's a need for envisioning in this space. There are different ideas, but, you know, at the scale that we need, there's not been enough support to really envision. So sometimes people will say, well, yeah, what about the JETPs? And of course, you know, there's different ideas about the success and the legitimacy of JETPs, but the biggest thing in my mind is they don't touch anywhere near on the revenue base that fossil fuels provide in those countries. So perhaps they are one solution as parts of a broader range, but in the time that we have, we need something more transformative. One idea that's out there that could be quite interesting is, you know, countries that are incentivized to endorse the treaty could create a buyers and sellers club, again, in line with the civil society equity review approach, where those that are producing fossil fuels but want to come off them can make a deal with the consumer countries and could bargain and make that agreement to, you know, import or export the fossil fuels in line with phasing down to 1.5 by the end, you know, by the timelines that have been set. So there are some interesting ideas out there that a treaty could really facilitate to move on. So just coming to the end of time, I just want to share the next steps of where we are. So we've obviously done that mapping, we've done a rapid assessment of, you know, some of the ideas that are out there. We have presented those to different countries that we're working with to just make sure that this feels like it's moving in a helpful direction, and we've had great feedback. And what we've done now is set up an expert working group. You know, we have so many experts in our network, and we also recognize that there is no one expert who can really provide the thinking that is needed to cover such a broad range of critical topics. So we've set up a group which is all experts from, again, the global south. Sorry to use that term again, but the real thinking there is, again, like, let's decolonize the discussion. Let's ensure that those who have been working on these issues around debt injustice, tax, around legal elements are being supported to get together and actually think about what we should be potentially proposing, again, all in line with the principles that have been set out for us by our stakeholders in civil society. So off the back of that working group, we're going to put out some kind of, you can say, propositional policy briefs over the next few months in those three areas that I mentioned, really just to kind of start a dialogue around what potentially could be negotiated within a treaty, and also what's important that's out there that as a collective, you know, as a movement, we should also be supporting, even if it isn't within a treaty, but should we a treaty linked to it, and should we be supporting the movement and advocacy around it because it's critical for addressing these wider issues. And then in early 2025, once we've really had all these dialogues and discussions and we've had feedback on these ideas, we'll collectively reflect on the progress and really get a sense of where we should push next. Here is a slide of our current expert working group. Happy to share more information. I have a much longer deck, but I'm sure some of you are aware of some of these members who are superstars in different areas. So I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions and at any point. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amira. I know it was a lot to absorb. And of course, this is not the only conversation. I'll request Amira to share her email ID. Please feel free to reach out to her if you need further information or you want to get involved with our work on just transition and number of reports that she talked about. We'll be more than happy to engage with you. Before we open the floor, and I also request you to put questions. There was a question earlier and I had responded, and I can see another question. we'll come to that. Before that, I'm going to request my colleague Shibayan to share a short, and Amira, you can stop sharing, and Shibayan will share a short video of some of the testimonies of people who were engaged in developing this paper and report on principles, values, and ideals. So, and of course, Kathy is here, so you can see Kathy once again and hear from her. You can start the video. Shibayan, audio is not working. It worked earlier when you shared. You can stop and share again. I can't hear. So I think you have to check that audio option as well if you have not. No, when you not here. When you start sharing, you did that earlier in the morning. Not here, not here. Stop sharing in the Zoom option. Okay, in the meantime, while you are doing it, in the meantime, I can respond to this question by Debajyoti Das. And there was also a similar question earlier, and absolutely valid question on Paris Agreement bringing all countries, and how treaty is going to encourage countries like Saudi Arabia or the US to join, and unless they join, the treaty is not going to be helpful. And this is exactly the question Dr. Das also asked. And our response to that is we need to understand the limitations of UNFCCC, and that's what I was presenting in my initial introduction. What it is offering is really lowest common denominator, because all countries have to agree. The kind of negotiations that happen in the UNFCCC space is not really taking us to that ambitious target, and the whole process of NDCs has the bottom up in this case is not helpful at all. And in fact, you see, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the US, which is now the largest fossil fuel producer. So that model definitely is not working. So what we are trying to do is to look at a different pathway where we are bringing in, and again, led by countries like Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and even Colombia, Timor-Leste joining. They are the ones, as the coalition of the willing, who are ambitious, who are putting forth strong targets, and they are going to be leading and putting pressure outside that system. Yes, in the initial setting, we may not have those countries joining. And to be honest, we know that they are not going to join, and they should not be joining the initial block, because then they're going to start diluting. So we would like this 13 countries that's a block should lead on drafting this treaty and then putting pressure through various ways. They can use the trade forums and finance and political leverage to actually put pressure on those countries to join. So you're absolutely right. We eventually need to see US, Canada, Australia, Norway, EU all joining the treaty. Without them, we will not be able to enable the just transition and, of course, international cooperation and support. And I see Amira also responding to that. Any other question, please, you can add it to the Q&A section. Shivan, you want to check if it's working now?
We are in a climate emergency. We need to get off of fossil fuels fast.
Fossil fuels not only drive climate change when we burn them, oil and gas as feedstocks in plastics, fertilizers and other petrochemicals accelerate a triple crisis of climate, biodiversity and toxic pollution.
The climate crisis caused by fossil fuels has disproportionate gender impacts and exacerbates further existing conflict and instability. We urgently need a fossil fuel treaty, as fossil fuels exacerbate conflict across the globe.
A fossil fuel treaty based on justice, human rights and ecology can help prevent dangerous distractions and speculative techno-fixes to allow space for the implementation of real solutions.
3 principles underscoring that treaty for me should be community consultation, decolonizing the financial system, and human rights and gender equality.
Conflict and insecurity, as well as environmental destruction due to mining, have disproportionate gendered impacts, which is another reason why affected and diverse communities must be included in the development and implementation of this treaty so that a just transition is conflict sensitive and gender responsive.
Y creemos que debemos empezar a debatir nuevos principios que permitan a los países que venimos desde el hemisferio sur poder proponer un tratado, poder poner principios que se basen en los contextos y dinámicas propias de comunidades, pueblos indígenas, comunidades campesinas, estudiantes, comunidades de fe, pero que responda eso también a las características propias de los países del hemisferio sur o del sur global.
And I believe that this is time for humanity to come together as one and say enough is enough. We need to start continuing preserving carbon sinks like the Okavango Delta. And that is why it is important for all of us to come together and sign on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty so we can protect these biodiversity hotspots for all of us, not only for me, not only for the communities in Kavango, but for all of us.
Thank you, Shiban. So those were some of the voices who are our allies and our supporters and also co-travelers in this journey and were very much part of this process. So any question, please feel free. In the meantime, Harpreet, I would like to check if there's anything that you would like to mention in response to what you saw people wrote on the slides and their view of treaty as a campaign and also this work on principles. Anything that you would like to reflect on their responses?
So it was heartening to see along that spectrum line a cluster towards those that were more hopeful that justice, rights, and the public good could be centered in the treaty going forward. A number of people also said that it depends on a lot, and this initial consultation process is very much that. We want to hear from you what you think is needed to make a treaty that is going to be delivering the type of change that's absolutely necessary, possible. So Amira and Harjeet will probably be the best people to speak to about the ways in which to input into the various different working groups and consultation opportunities going forward. In terms of what's resonating, the holistic approach, not just viewing this as a climate issue, came up again as it did in our session this morning. And that was something that came up quite a lot throughout our consultations, the way in which a supply side treaty could create the mechanisms that could really drive systems change, whether that's in relation to energy or transport or food and other systems that are very carbon or fossil fuel intensive. And in terms of gaps, the potential limitations on enforcement mechanisms came up, and inequalities in broader inequities between the North and South came up as well. Amira talked a little bit about the investment treaties and how they are obstacles currently to a just transition, and that's come up again in these post-it notes. But what we have heard both this morning and today is overall really positive view towards these 3 fundamental principles, and also Amira providing some fascinating ideas on how they might be used to test future proposals for the treaty going forward as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. Amira, anything that you would like to say, respond to the question?
Nothing like super additional. I think I covered quite a lot, but just to say that, you know, my inbox is always open. We are very conscious that, you know, these are very complex, broad topics, and we want to make sure that any kind of conversations that we're trying to have around them are seen to be helpful and progressing us further towards a more just system. So yeah, please do reach out if you'd like to, even just to feedback and say, that doesn't make sense to me. Those conversations are always super helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Harpreet and Amira. And yes, on the question in terms of getting involved, so we do our monthly network calls. So if you are part of the network or you want to, you can go on our website, join, or send us an email. And we have, in fact, calls every month. So one series of such calls is happening tomorrow. So send us an email and we will send you an invite to join. We also have different working groups like legal working group. We also have political working groups. We have campaign working groups. So if you would like to contribute, engage, we can definitely create opportunities for you to join and support us. And I can also see a question from Andrea, who has been carrying our flag in Italy. And you know, Andrea, we've not heard anything directly from Italy, and we really look to you and working together to put pressure on Italy to start engaging. And of course, we would like to see such countries coming forward and showing that commitment. As we have seen those two questions, we want it to be led by vulnerable countries and countries who are more ambitious, but we also need to have countries like Italy and European Union and others on board. I can see a question from Mehboob, a Nobel laureate who's now the head of Bangladesh government, is actually one of our champions, and he supported treaty. You can see his name on our website. So one of the 100 Nobel laureates who initially supported our call for a fossil fuel-free future. So definitely, thank you very much for your suggestion, Mehboob. We would like to see Bangladesh also endorsing the treaty, joining the group of 13 nations right now. So definitely, please reach out to us. Very happy to work with you to get him involved. And some of us are going to be in New York as well. Right, we are on top of the hour, and thank you so much for joining and engaging. And of course, as Amira said, our doors are open, our inboxes are welcoming your ideas and inputs. So please do reach out to us. Amira, if you can share your email ID, I can put in mine. So please feel free to reach out, and we'll keep updating you, involving you in our journey going forward. Thank you very much. Let me share my email ID as well before I conclude. So that's my email ID. Thank you again, and thank you everybody for your support. And thank you, Kathy, Amira, Harpreet, Kiki, Pamela, Shibayan, Zoe, Akanksha, for all your support. Thank you very much.